It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the hallways of one of the country's most influential corporations. A man who had everything, wealth, power, and the respect of an entire industry, found himself drawn to someone who seemed worlds apart from his carefully cultivated life. He was the embodiment of success, the face of a business empire, admired by his peers and envied by rivals. She, on the other hand, was young, ambitious, and navigating her way through a demanding professional world, eager to prove herself in an environment where the stakes were high and the margins for error were razor-thin. At first, it was nothing more than polite exchanges, the kind you'd expect between a superior and an employee. A glance that lingered a second too long, a shared laugh in an otherwise tense meeting. Those small, inconsequential moments that no one notices until they do. It wasn't long before these interactions became more frequent, more personal. Late-night calls that began as work-related and drifted into conversations that neither of them would admit carried a dangerous undertone. They were drawn to each other, not just by attraction, but by the thrill of a secret that only they shared. This wasn't the kind of connection that could remain hidden for long, though. Not in an office filled with watchful eyes and whispered gossip. People started to notice. A lingering hand during a brief exchange, a quiet conversation behind closed doors. It was the kind of intrigue that fueled speculation and blurred the line between professional and personal. But those closest to them dismissed it as harmless, a distraction for one, an opportunity for the other. No one could have imagined how far it would go. No one could have predicted the storm that was building. As their secret deepened, so did the complications. He had a family, a picture-perfect one at that, a wife who was a fixture at charity galas and corporate functions, the kind of woman who seemed untouchable in her own right. Children who adored him, a home that was the very definition of stability and success. She had her own ambitions, dreams of climbing the corporate ladder, dreams that she believed he could help her achieve. For a time, they convinced themselves that they could keep everything under control, that they could live their lives as if the choices they were making in the shadows wouldn't spill out into the light. But the cracks began to show, subtle at first. A strained look during a meeting, a text message read and immediately deleted, words exchanged in anger when no one else was around to hear them. And then there were the rumors, whispers that grew louder with every passing week. For those who were paying attention, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Yet still, no one could have guessed what lay ahead. What was it that kept them tethered to each other? Was it love, lust, or something far more complicated? Their lives had become a labyrinth of lies and half-truths, each decision pulling them deeper into a reality they could no longer control. And then, one night, it all unraveled. One choice, one moment, shattered the delicate balance they had tried so desperately to maintain. What happened next would horrify even the most seasoned investigators. It would leave their colleagues and loved ones questioning how they had missed the signs, how such violence could erupt from a connection that had once seemed so ordinary, so human. But that's the thing about secrets. They have a way of turning on the people who keep them, and this secret was no exception. What led these two individuals, each with so much to lose, to the edge of destruction? Was it ambition, desperation, or the weight of their own lies catching up with them? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, could any of it have been prevented? Welcome back to Echoes of Crime, where the past speaks and the truth demands to be heard. I'm honored to have you here as we delve into another gripping case. To my returning subscribers, thank you for your unwavering support. It means the world to me. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story. Richard Coleman was a man who lived a life most people could only dream of. At 47, he had built an empire with his own hands, rising from modest beginnings to become the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. His name was synonymous with power and success, a symbol of what ambition and relentless drive could achieve. He was celebrated in glossy business magazines, invited to exclusive events, and regularly photographed alongside world leaders and celebrities. His public image was carefully curated. He was the charismatic businessman with the Midas touch. Every venture he touched turned to gold. Colleagues admired his sharp mind and his ability to think 10 steps ahead, while competitors feared him for the very same reasons. To outsiders, Richard seemed untouchable, the epitome of success. His personal life appeared equally enviable. He lived in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, complete with manicured gardens, a private tennis court, and a garage filled with luxury cars. His wife, elegant and poised, was often seen at his side during charity galas, a picture-perfect partner who complemented his success. They had 2 teenage children enrolled in the most elite private schools, further solidifying the image of a perfect family. But those who worked closely with Richard saw another side. Beneath the charm and confidence, there was a man who thrived on control. He was a perfectionist who demanded excellence in every aspect of his life. His employees learned quickly that there was no room for error in Richard's world. Mistakes were met with an icy stare or a sharp reprimand, and even his closest colleagues walked on eggshells around him. Richard didn't just demand control over his business. He needed control over everything. This need for dominance extended to his relationships, his routines, and even the smallest details of his environment. It was this side of him that made him both admired and feared, a man whose presence could electrify a room, but also leave it in silence with a single word. It was into this world of power and pressure that Sarah Price entered. Sarah was 28 years old, a young woman with big dreams and the determination to make them a reality. She had grown up in a small town, raised by a single mother who worked long hours just to make ends meet. From an early age, Sarah learned the value of hard work and resilience. She put herself through college, juggling part-time jobs while studying late into the night. When she graduated, Sarah was determined to make something of herself. She envisioned a future where she could escape the struggles of her past and build a life of stability and success. Landing the job as Richard Coleman's executive assistant felt like the first step toward that future. It was an opportunity most people would kill for, a chance to work alongside one of the most powerful men in the corporate world. At first, Sarah threw herself into her work, determined to prove her worth. The job was demanding, with long hours and relentless expectations, but Sarah thrived under the pressure. She was sharp, efficient, and quick to adapt, qualities that didn't go unnoticed by Richard. Initially, their relationship was purely professional. Sarah admired Richard for his confidence and drive, and Richard valued Sarah's ability to keep up with his fast-paced world. But as the months went by, the dynamic between them began to shift. There were small moments that hinted at something deeper. Richard would thank Sarah for her hard work, his tone warmer than usual. Late-night meetings in his office stretched longer, their conversations drifting from work to more personal topics. He complimented her intelligence, her ambition, her attention to detail. For Sarah, who had spent much of her life feeling overlooked, Richard's attention was intoxicating. She began to feel like she wasn't just an assistant, she was someone Richard trusted, someone who mattered to him. And perhaps she did, but that trust came with an invisible cost. As their connection deepened, Sarah's role in Richard's life expanded. She became more than an assistant. She was his confidant, the one person who seemed to truly understand the pressures he faced. She knew his routines, his preferences, even his vulnerabilities. Her presence in his office became constant, and with it came whispers. Colleagues noticed the change. Sarah, who had once been focused and ambitious, now seemed distracted, her energy consumed by the demands of her boss. People speculated about the nature of their relationship, though no one dared confront Richard directly. In the office, his word was law, and challenging him was unthinkable. The office itself became a character in their story, a towering skyscraper in the heart of the city, its sleek glass facade reflecting the ambition and power within. Richard's corner office sat at the very top, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. The room was a testament to his authority, filled with custom furniture, abstract art, and the hum of silence that came with absolute control. It was in this space that the boundaries between Richard and Sarah began to blur. Meetings became private, their conversations increasingly personal. Sarah's responsibilities grew to include tasks that went far beyond her job description, and the intensity of their interactions raised eyebrows among those who worked nearby. Despite the whispers, no one could have predicted what was to come. The polished surface of Richard's world masked the cracks forming beneath. Tensions were building, invisible to most, but palpable to those closest to them. Sarah found herself caught in a web she didn't fully understand. Richard's charm, which had once been so captivating, began to take on a darker edge. His need for control extended beyond the boardroom, seeping into every interaction they shared. What had started as admiration and trust now felt suffocating. Yet Sarah didn't know how to pull away. And Richard, for all his power and composure, seemed to be unraveling in his own way. The pressures of his empire, the cracks in his carefully constructed life, and the growing intensity of his relationship with Sarah all pointed to an inevitable breaking point. The affair didn't begin with a grand gesture or a dramatic confession. It crept in quietly, like a shadow stretching longer as the sun begins to set. At first, their interactions seemed innocent. Casual conversations after hours, moments of shared laughter over a misstep in a meeting, the subtle warmth of mutual admiration. Sarah Price, young, ambitious, and eager to belong, found herself captivated by Richard Coleman's presence. For Sarah, it was hard to ignore the way Richard looked at her, the way he seemed to truly see her. In a world where she had always fought to be noticed, to be respected, Richard's attention felt like validation. He wasn't just her boss. He was a man who commanded rooms, made decisions that shaped entire industries, and yet he had chosen to share his world with her, his thoughts, his frustrations, his vulnerabilities. For Richard, Sarah became a refuge, a reprieve from the relentless expectations of his life. She listened in a way no one else did, without judgment or pretense. Over time, the boundaries between them blurred. The professional compliments became personal. He began to notice details about her, how she always tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, how her laugh had a way of softening even the hardest days. Their connection grew in the spaces between meetings and deadlines, in the quiet moments when the office lights dimmed and the rest of the staff had gone home. What began as long conversations about work slowly shifted into something more. Richard would linger by her desk, asking about her life, her dreams, and her fears. And Sarah, who had always kept her guard up, began to open up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else. The stolen moments became bolder. A lunch meeting stretched into an afternoon. A business trip to a neighboring city turned into a shared dinner at an out-of-the-way restaurant. They avoided labels, but the nature of their relationship became unmistakable. Behind the polished doors of Richard's office, their interactions grew more intimate, a hand brushing against hers as he handed her a file. A lingering glance that held more meaning than words could express. But secrecy, by its nature, breeds tension. What might have begun as thrilling, whispers exchanged when no one else was around, the rush of stolen moments soon gave way to something darker. The weight of their clandestine relationship began to press down on them, shaping their interactions in ways neither could fully control. Richard, so used to being in command, began to feel the first stirrings of jealousy. When Sarah laughed with a male colleague in the break room or stayed late working with someone else, he noticed. At first it was subtle, questions disguised as curiosity, comments laced with subtext. But as their relationship deepened, so did his need for control. For Sarah, the attention that had once felt validating began to feel suffocating. She found herself torn between her admiration for Richard and the growing realization that his affection came with unspoken expectations. His compliments were followed by criticism. His generosity masked an underlying demand for loyalty. The cracks in their relationship didn't go unnoticed. In an office where whispers traveled faster than emails, their closeness became the subject of speculation. Co-workers noticed the way Richard's demeanor softened when Sarah was around, the way his gaze followed her across the room. Arguments, once confined to whispered conversations behind closed doors, began to spill into public spaces. Colleagues overheard raised voices through the thin walls of Richard's office, fragments of tense conversations that hinted at trouble. "You don't get to decide what I can and can't do. I'm only trying to protect you, Sarah." The tension was palpable. Sarah's once confident stride became hesitant. She began avoiding eye contact, her focus divided. Richard, too, seemed changed. His temper flared more often, his control slipping in ways that unsettled even his most loyal employees. And then there were the messages, cryptic emails, terse texts sent late at night. One coworker who later testified recalled seeing Richard's phone light up during a meeting. The name Sarah flashed across the screen, accompanied by a message that read, "We need to talk. Now." Outside the office, Richard's wife began to notice his absences. Late nights at work turned into missed dinners, and his excuses, once convincing, began to sound hollow. Sarah, too, felt the strain. The secrecy, the constant vigilance, it wore on her. She began to wonder if the promises Richard had made, the dreams of a future together, of leaving behind the complications of their lives, were anything more than empty words. The events of that day began like any other. Sarah arrived at the office early, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. Richard had already been in his office for hours, the light spilling out into the hallway. Their first interaction was strained. Witnesses later recalled seeing Sarah exit his office, her face pale, her eyes red. She avoided conversation, retreating to her desk with a visible tension that set her apart from the usual hum of the workplace. Throughout the day, Richard's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He canceled meetings, snapped at employees, and spent hours locked away in his office. Those who approached him were met with a cold, distracted demeanor. By mid-afternoon, things escalated. CCTV footage from the office building captured Sarah entering Richard's office one final time. The door closed behind her, and for nearly an hour, nothing unusual was noted. But those working in nearby offices later reported hearing muffled voices, escalating into shouting. One co-worker, staying late to finalize a report, described hearing a loud crash, followed by silence. It was unsettling enough to make them pause, but not enough to act. Inside the office, things had turned violent. The arguments that had simmered between Richard and Sarah over the preceding weeks had finally erupted. What exactly was said in those final moments will never be known, but evidence suggests that Richard's need for control and Sarah's growing defiance reached a breaking point. The attack was swift and brutal. The glass paperweight from Richard's desk was used as a weapon, its edges sharp enough to cause severe injuries. Blood spatter on the walls and carpet indicated a violent struggle, with Sarah trying desperately to escape her attacker. Her injuries showed she had fought back, but she was ultimately overpowered. It wasn't until hours later, close to midnight, that the scene was discovered. A cleaner, going about her nightly routine, pushed open the door to Richard's office. At first, she thought the room was empty, the dimmed lights casting long shadows across the space. But as she stepped inside, her gaze fell to the floor. Sarah lay face down near the desk, her body still. Blood pooled beneath her head, staining the light carpet in a deep, visceral red. The cleaner froze, her breath catching as the horrifying reality of what she was seeing sank in. Dropping her cleaning supplies, she stumbled backward and ran, dialing emergency services with shaking hands. Police arrived minutes later, securing the scene. The office was eerily silent, save for the muffled static of their radios. The scene they walked into was chilling. Sarah's injuries spoke to the ferocity of the attack, while the chaos in the room told a story of desperation. Papers were scattered across the floor, a chair lay overturned, and shards of the bloodied paperweight glinted under the fluorescent lights. As investigators combed through the scene, they found something that changed the course of the investigation entirely. Behind Richard's desk, tucked beneath a pile of crumpled papers, was Sarah's scarf, bloodied and torn. It appeared to have been hastily hidden, an attempt to conceal evidence. Nearby, a second discovery deepened the mystery. A series of faint, bloody footprints led from the desk to the door, out into the hallway, and down toward the building's rear exit. The footprints matched the soles of Richard Coleman's designer shoes, later found abandoned in the parking garage. The evidence painted a grim picture. After the attack, Richard had attempted to clean up. He discarded the scarf, tried to wipe down parts of the desk, and left the building in haste. But in his panic, he'd left behind enough clues to implicate himself. The search for Richard Coleman began immediately. His car was found abandoned just a few miles from the office, parked haphazardly in a grocery store lot. His phone was located nearby, wiped of recent activity, but still containing damning traces of communication with Sarah. For 2 days, Richard seemed to vanish. His wife told police she hadn't seen him since the morning of the murder, and his children were equally in the dark. Investigators tracked his movements using credit card transactions and surveillance footage, piecing together a trail that led them to a roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. When officers entered the room, they found Richard sitting on the edge of the bed. His suit jacket was rumpled, his tie loosened, and his once polished shoes were gone. He didn't flinch when the door burst open, nor did he resist when they placed him in handcuffs. In the interrogation room, Richard's demeanor was unnerving. He was calm, too calm. When asked if he knew why he was there, he nodded slowly, but when pressed about the crime, his answers became cryptic. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I didn't mean for it to go that far. She didn't listen. I told her to stop. At times, Richard shifted blame onto Sarah, painting her as the instigator. Other times, he appeared almost remorseful, his voice trailing off as if grappling with the weight of his actions. But when presented with the evidence, the bloody footprints, the torn scarf, the CCTV footage, he offered no explanation. Instead, he simply muttered, "You wouldn't understand." Richard's calm exterior cracked only once. When investigators mentioned Sarah by name, his jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and for a moment, he seemed to lose his composure. But just as quickly, he regained control, retreating into silence. The evidence against him was overwhelming. In the end, it wasn't a single mistake that led to his capture, but a series of small, careless errors. A blood-stained scarf, abandoned shoes, and the arrogance of believing he could escape unscathed. The discovery of Sarah Price's body and the arrest of Richard Coleman shattered the facade of his perfect life. What had begun as a secret affair built on power and control had spiraled into a tragedy of jealousy, obsession, and violence. And as the case unfolded, the world would come to see just how far Richard had fallen. The investigation into Sarah Price's murder was exhaustive and meticulously detailed, piecing together a timeline of events that revealed the true depths of Richard Coleman's actions. Detectives worked around the clock, sifting through evidence, interviewing witnesses, and compiling the puzzle pieces of what had unfolded in that office. Richard's initial calm demeanor during his arrest quickly faded under scrutiny. Police began with a full forensic sweep of the office, uncovering further evidence that pointed to premeditation rather than a crime of passion. The bloodied paperweight matched the pattern of injuries on Sarah's head. Strands of her hair were found embedded in Richard's watch band, a chilling detail that showed just how violent the encounter had been. The torn scarf, discarded in a pile of papers, became a cornerstone of the case. Forensic experts identified both Richard's and Sarah's DNA on the fabric, linking him directly to the attack. The footprints, too, were damning, traced to a pair of custom-made shoes that only Richard owned, later recovered from a dumpster near the parking garage. Interrogations of office staff revealed a pattern of behavior that many had dismissed as mere gossip before Sarah's death. Several employees spoke of overhearing heated arguments between Richard and Sarah in the weeks leading up to the murder. One colleague recalled Sarah confiding that Richard had become increasingly possessive and controlling, even in professional matters. Surveillance footage filled in the gaps. Cameras captured Sarah entering Richard's office that evening and never leaving. Minutes after her arrival, Richard was seen hurriedly exiting, carrying a small bag and looking visibly agitated. He took the stairs to the parking garage, bypassing the elevators, a detail that detectives interpreted as an attempt to avoid further cameras. The trial of Richard Coleman was nothing short of a media spectacle. The CEO of one of the country's most powerful corporations, now standing accused of a brutal murder, was a story that captivated the public and filled headlines. For weeks, news anchors dissected every piece of evidence, while social media buzzed with theories and outrage. The prosecution's case was airtight. They presented forensic evidence that left little room for doubt, from the fingerprints on the weapon to the blood-stained clothing. The timeline of events, supported by surveillance footage and witness testimony, painted a damning picture of a man who had let his obsession and rage spiral into violence. The most powerful testimony came from Sarah's friends and colleagues who described her growing unease in the weeks leading up to her death. One friend revealed text messages Sarah had sent shortly before the murder, confiding that Richard had become impossible to work with and that she was considering quitting. Another colleague recounted how Sarah once said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm walking on eggshells around him." Richard's defense team attempted to paint a different narrative. They argued that the crime was not premeditated, but a tragic accident, the result of an argument that had spiraled out of control. They described Richard as a man under immense pressure, overwhelmed by the demands of his position and the personal turmoil in his life. But their arguments faltered under the weight of the evidence. The prosecution countered by pointing to Richard's calculated attempts to cover his tracks: the abandoned shoes, the torn scarf, the wiped phone. They argued that these actions were not those of a man acting in the heat of the moment, but of someone trying to escape accountability. Throughout the trial, Richard's demeanor drew sharp criticism. He remained composed, almost detached, showing little emotion even as graphic details of the murder were presented. When asked directly if he felt remorse for Sarah's death, his response was chillingly vague. "I wish things had been different." The public's response to the case was one of overwhelming shock and outrage. Richard Coleman, once celebrated as a symbol of success and power, was now reviled as a manipulative and dangerous man. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with demonstrators holding signs demanding justice for Sarah. The media dissected every aspect of the story, from the age gap between Richard and Sarah to the dynamics of power and privilege in their relationship. Opinion pieces flooded news outlets, questioning how someone with so much influence could have gone unchecked for so long. Social media amplified the outrage. Hashtags like "Near's Justice for Sarah" and "Why Not Power Corrupts" trended for weeks, as people around the world expressed their anger and heartbreak over the case. Many saw Sarah as a victim, not just of Richard's violence, but of a broader system that allowed powerful men to exploit and manipulate those beneath them. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with a mix of relief and frustration. While many felt justice had been served, others argued that no sentence could truly account for the loss of Sarah's life. Richard's once loyal supporters abandoned him, and his reputation was permanently tarnished. The company he had built announced his resignation within hours of the verdict, distancing itself from the man who had once been its figurehead. The case left a profound impact, not just on those directly involved, but on society as a whole. Within the company, sweeping changes were implemented to address workplace harassment and power imbalances, a direct response to the revelations that had emerged during the trial. For Sarah's family and friends, the loss was immeasurable. Her mother, speaking at a press conference after the verdict, tearfully described her daughter as a bright light extinguished far too soon. A scholarship fund was established in Sarah's name to support young women pursuing careers in business, ensuring her legacy would live on. As the courtroom doors closed and Richard Coleman was led away in handcuffs, the world couldn't help but ask, how did it come to this? How did a man who seemingly had it all, a thriving career, a picture-perfect family, and the admiration of so many, fall so far, so fast? And how did Sarah Price, a young woman full of potential and hope, become ensnared in the dark corners of his unraveling world? It's easy to focus on the shocking details of this case: the brutal crime, the courtroom drama, the media frenzy. But the deeper questions linger. Was Richard's fall from grace inevitable, driven by his unrelenting need for control and power? Or were there moments along the way where this tragedy could have been prevented? Could someone have seen the warning signs earlier, stepped in, and stopped the chain of events before it spiraled into violence? For Sarah's friends and family, these questions remain unanswered, haunting their memories and shaping their grief. Justice, in the form of a life sentence for Richard Coleman, may have been served, but does it truly heal the wounds left behind? But perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: how many other stories like Sarah's are unfolding right now, unnoticed and unresolved? How many people are caught in situations where power is used as a weapon, where ambition blinds empathy, and where silence allows darkness to grow unchecked? We want to hear from you. Do you think justice was truly served in this case? Could someone have intervened before it was too late? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're listening. And if you found this story as chilling as we did, there's more to come. Next week, we'll dive into the case of a newlywed couple whose honeymoon took a sinister turn when the bride mysteriously vanished without a trace. What really happened on that remote island? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. These tales aren't just about the darkness in the world. They're about uncovering truths, seeking justice, and remembering the lives behind the headlines. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay safe and stay vigilant.